Well, hello there, and welcome to Conversations in Color, coming from the beautiful Jam Theater inside the Pablo Center in downtown Eau Claire, Wisconsin. So glad that you are joining us, and we are excited about this episode tonight. We're going to have some great conversation. Before we get into the conversation, though, I wanted to mention how we like to converse with one another, kind of have an ethos for this show. First of all, we want to treat each person with dignity and value that's inherent as a human being in them. So humanity is one of our big tenets. Another one is humility. Now we come into these conversations knowing that there's a lot that we don't know. And we bring that to bear in our conversation, and we speak with humility and encourage each other to live in that humility. And then lastly, but certainly not leastly, is honesty. We want to not shy away from hard questions. We really want to ask the hard stuff and lean in and wrestle with the hard stuff. So that's what this thing is about. We want this to be a space where we can come together and talk about hard things and connect and find peace and healing in these things. Well, I want to introduce you to my partner in crime, our resident panelist here tonight. She is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire in history. She is the president of Uniting Bridges. She has titles in 15,000 different organizations and wears too many hats. My partner in crime, Dr. Selika Ducksworth-Lawton.
I'm happy to be here, and I'm honored to be here with Dr. Barker and Ms. Lang.
All right. And next up, we have Dr. Debra Barker, who is also a professor at the university here in town, and she directs the American Indian Studies program. She has been at the university since 1993, which I believe is about the same amount of time as Dr. Selika. 2 times distinguished award winner at UW-Eau Claire, outstanding woman of color in education winner as well in the University of Wisconsin system. And then she also has something she would like to read before we get started here. So if you would, Dr. Barker, please.
This is a new tradition that's been introduced at our university, and it's the Land Acknowledgement. I acknowledge that the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire occupies the sacred and ancestral lands of Indigenous people. I honor the land of the Ojibwe, Dakota, and Ho-Chunk nations. And at most occasions, even with our meetings at ULEC, for instance, the University Liberal Arts meeting, we routinely will make this land acknowledgement. And it extends respect to the ancestors whose bones remain cradled in the land of Western Wisconsin.
Thank you. Very appropriate, too, for what we're talking about tonight, so thank you very much. And then we also have Katie Langer joining us tonight. She has spoken at several of our local rallies here in the recent months after the George Floyd murder over in Minneapolis. She is a soon-to-be graduating senior at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. She is a part of the Red Lake Band of Ojibwe. Excuse me. And she's had her own experiences here when it comes to racism toward people of color in general, but specifically Indigenous peoples, and we'll probably ask her to tell that story a little bit later.
And
but
she's
Katie,
a joy in class.
And she's a joy in class, apparently.
A joy in class.
Welcome, Katie. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Last, but certainly not least, is our good friend Adam Accola, who is the man who does a lot of the running of CoLab downtown and is an integral part of this whole operation. Adam, welcome once again. Thank you for being here. And what are you going to be doing tonight?
Yeah, no problem. I will be focusing on audience engagement tonight. So if you have questions that you want to have interspersed into this conversation, please just drop them in the chat on the Paragon live stream on Pablo Center's website. If you are not listening on the Paragon stream and are tuning in on Converge Radio 99.9 FM, you can call in to 715-600-0267. One more time, that's 715-600-0267. And we'll ask those questions of our panelists this evening. So be sure to get involved in the conversation. If you've got questions, drop them in the chat for us.
So, Adam, can you help us out and get this conversation rolling?
Yeah, I figured tonight, since we're going to be focusing a lot on our land and our the space that we occupy in the United States, if you could live in any other country, where would you like to live and why? Ed, let's start with you.
This is a hard one for me. So I have spiritual roots in India, and I have family roots in Ethiopia because my son's from Ethiopia. And I love both of those places a lot. I'm kind of thinking it's going to be Ethiopia because I just dig Ethiopian culture. And I still remember actually the last time that I went there, which was way too long ago, going to Tewahedo Orthodox Church on a Sunday morning for a service. And it felt like I was stepping back into the 3rd century. It was amazing, the incense and what people were wearing. It was awe-inspiring, to be honest. So I could do with a little bit more of that. And plus, the coffee's amazing. Katie, how about you?
I would probably say Canada.
Canada?
Because there's Ojibwe people up in Canada as well. So if I can't be in my own land, might as well go to my family. Because, I mean, it's just a border.
That's right.
It's just a border, and I think that being close to your ancestral lands is important, especially for growing and having like connections. So yeah.
Great. That's probably a more responsible, well-grounded answer than mine. Dr. Barker, how about you?
My irresponsible answer would be to be in Malaysia on Langkawi Island. Would be snorkeling, would be reading, would be waiting for the next meal, or cooking. The other part of me would like to be within the boundaries of the Lakota Nation, which is not the United States.
Gotcha.
The Black Hills.
All right. Selika, how about you?
I think I'd like to go to Ghana. In part because a lot of the enslaved Africans who were brought to the area of the United States I'm from came from Nigeria and Ghana and Sierra Leone. And I do a lot of tracing of the Africanisms that we have in Louisiana and Mississippi, and a lot of them really go back to Ghana and Nigeria. And I want to see the country for myself and know the culture that especially on my dad's side, came from. My mom's side is French and Spanish and Yakima Indian, Yaka, I should say, Indian. And my dad's side is pretty much African without a lot of admixture. So I'd really like to go to Ghana.
Do you want to go there or do you want to live there?
It would depend. We have stereotypes of what it would be like, but I know that when you go somewhere else, eventually they say you're an American.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, eventually you wind up longing for whatever you think of as home.
Right.
And wherever my children wind up, I'll probably wind up as home.
You've got to draw.
So I don't really know where I'm going to wind up.
Well, Adam, how about you?
I think there are a couple places that I would be comfortable in, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, but I think I would really love to go back and live in Costa Rica. I studied abroad there in college, went back and interned there the following summer, and every time that I land, every time that I visited ever since, it feels like going home. So I'd say Costa Rica is like one of my places that I could definitely see myself living.
I think you should pack me in your bag next time you go.
let's go for an awesome trip.
You'll probably have to pay extra for the baggage, but because that'll be over the weight limit. All right. Well, thanks everybody. We like to do that because at the end of the day, this is a conversation. And I was sharing with you all earlier that if I had my way, we'd be doing this around a coffee table and having a cup of coffee. But obviously, we can't do that these days. So I'm going to share a little bit of what I know about Indigenous history here in Western Wisconsin. And then I'm going to let these folks correct me because I'm sure I will get some things wrong. From what I understand, the First Nations, Indigenous folks have been here for thousands of years. And the land, and I'm going to say it like this, belonged to these people. And that's something we'll talk a little bit about, I think, a little later, the whole nature of land belonging to people, that kind of thing. In the 1600s, European fur traders and missionaries came. And for the most part, they worked together with the people who were native to this land. Around 1800, things really began to change. In 1804, the Sauk and Fox groups ceded their lands in a treaty with the government, or with the settlers and the government that they didn't agree to. By 1871, most Indigenous peoples were on reservations. And by that time, the government didn't deem it important to deal with them in terms of treaties. In fact, it was about basically wiping their culture clean, de-Indianizing the population, if you will. And if you look at the history of the interaction between European settlers and their descendants and Indigenous peoples, not only here in Wisconsin, but throughout the United States history, it's a history of degradation and theft. And we want to talk a little bit about some of that stuff tonight, and it's apropos since today is Indigenous Peoples Day, formerly known as Columbus Day, and that is an irony and relationship that we will talk about tonight as well. But we're calling this conversation tonight, This Land Is My Land. We're all familiar with the song, This Land Is My Land, This Land Is Your Land. I want to talk a little bit, Dr. Barker, you mentioned you did the Land Acknowledgement earlier, and that's something for me that's new, and that I've only noticed in the last couple of years, and I think is really, I think it's a really good thing. It's a powerful statement. I want to talk a little bit about this concept of stolen land and the nature of land and its relationship with people. Katie, if I could, I want to start with you because we talked about this a little bit earlier. For the group that you're from, the Red Lake Band of Ojibwe, did it make sense that people owned land in the first place?
I mean, it doesn't make sense that for most Indigenous cultures that we own land, since I feel like our role is to take care of the land. We play this role as caretaker rather than ownership, because with ownership comes this entitlement that we really don't have, because it's not really ours in the first place. We're taking care of it for the future generations.
Sure.
And so for us, this idea of ownership is a little we didn't understand what ownership was when we signed the treaties that we that ceded most of Wisconsin.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go
because in most of Wisconsin, we thought we were giving up the lumber. And so when we thought we were giving up the lumber, we were actually giving up the land. But since there was this miscommunication between the government and my ancestors, it kind of ended up that way.
Right.
Even though we did still reserve a right to hunt, fish, and gather, which caused the walleye wars in the 90s. For me personally, I just feel land, ownership isn't really something, it's different. It's a very European, Eurocentric viewpoint, because how can we hold something that's holding us, I feel.
Sure.
I feel it's more of our job to take care of the land and respect it and make sure it can continue on for future generations. And you can't really do that
Right.
if you're owning it and you're treating it like property, because it kind of puts space in between you and the land, as when you don't see it as ownership and living with it.
Right.
It kind of brings this whole deeper connection.
Yeah. So if you could, and I would ask Dr. Barker and Selika to comment on this too. Actually, I'll direct it towards you two. Can you talk a little bit about what the nature of the relationship between, in many indigenous cultures, the relationship between person and land, and what does that look like, and what is that supposed to? Because Katie shared her perspective, which gives a little bit of the historical perspective, I think, as well as her own kind of take on, how we should respect the land. Dr. Barker, can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, thinking, just sort of picking up from what Katie was saying a moment ago about land ownership. I have an immediate answer to your question about our relationship with land. There are territorial and political issues that are folded into the conversations around land in the Dakotas, because I am a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe, and so my history is firmly rooted in South Dakota. Historically, the hundreds of tribes in that region, and understanding that when Columbus came, there were over 500 and upward of 600 very different Indian nations. Mm-hmm. And today we're down to 576 or so federally recognized nations. And this, of course, doesn't account for the unrecognized nations. But originally, before contact, there was a lot of competition for territorial hunting grounds and for the places where people would travel routinely. And that was worked out and understood amongst the people there. It wasn't until gold was discovered in California that this land fever set in, and picking up from the conquest of the upper Midwest and then moving after the end of the Civil War and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad 12 years after the Civil War ended, that America just sort of blew up into warfare. The treatment of the land for the Lakota people was pretty. They're witnessing it was a pretty monumental event as they're watching the wagon trains come through. The pioneers were great litter bugs. They were leaving their pianos and their musical instruments and their tables and so on and so forth as they're heading through. There's a lot of mystique around land that gets folded up into the Columbus mythology. But I'll return to your original question about how my ancestors thought and felt and philosophized around land. And I think that we share a lot of the same perspectives, and that is that land was the origin of life, that our origin myths have us emerging from the ground, from the darkness into the light, in the same way we emerge from our mother's bodies. Mm-hmm. And in the way that we respect our mother's bodies, we likewise respect the earth. And so we, to view the way that land has become something that was sacred and alive and living to simply real estate, mm-hmm. and arenas of conflict has been something that has been very heartbreaking to witness as we learn about this, because many of us grew up in public educations where we were not taught a balanced, more objective perspective right. on history or any of the mythologized figures who populated the Euro-American imagination.
Yeah. Selika's got a burgeoning thought, but before you, I could tell, because I could see that by the posture that you had a burgeoning thought, but I gotta just hold for a second. Because I think one of the things I think that's a really important dynamic in all of this for us to acknowledge is, and Katie alluded to this, you have people with a cultural, with a worldview, seeing themselves connected deeply to the land. There's a symbiotic relationship. It's connection. And then you have another people coming in with the worldview of, I own stuff and I want to own more stuff, including land. And then you also have language differences. And so when you throw in those different cultural takes as well as the language differences, I mean, can we talk a little bit about how that set all of these relationships up to be failures and for it to not work well? And what do you do with those kind of cultural differences? And I don't know, Selika, if you were going to speak to any of that or not, but.
Well, I was going to say something different, but it's okay. I can go this way, which is that it doesn't matter whether we're talking about indigenous people or African people. When missionaries show up, bad things happen. And missionaries, unfortunately, in this period, and when we're talking about indigenous in the West, or when we're talking about Florida, et cetera, we're really talking about Catholicism and Canada, there were attempts at cultural genocide. And land is a part of that, and eradicating the idea of custodianship of that land is a part of that cultural genocide. And you really see, almost from the beginning here, and I'll talk about this area, in the colonies, 1660, the first indentured servant laws exempted Africans and Indians not taxed from the protections against being just unilaterally killed or beaten. And then when we get to lifelong servitude, it says Africans and indigenous. And the only reason they didn't enslave indigenous people is that indigenous people could run away. But from the beginning, you know, I can't say that the relationship went away. Europeans came in with bad faith. And while there may have been individuals who were okay, the overarching ideal here was bad faith. And I mean, as we move into the West and the Indian school, you know, the phrase that keeps going through my mind is save the man, kill the Indian, that the schools used, assimilation, which is a part of this cultural genocide. And this is where we see that twinning of African American and indigenous history, because many indigenous people helped African Americans. I'm thinking of the Choctaw, where I am, and how they also saw themselves as stewards of the land, but they would help escaped Africans to get out of Port Orleans, because they didn't believe in power. Europeans think land is power. And can't think in a frame where land is not power.
So so I just want to bolster what you're saying right there, because one of the indications of that reality that Europeans see land as power is the whole idea of how the Electoral College was set up, that only landowners could vote, that kind of thing. You know, like the way the system was built in the beginning of American history.
But where they pushed indigenous people to, and this is that landscape of race. And Dr. Barker, you might want to jump in on top of me on here. The land where we put people, where we push people to, has meaning. And pushing people into land that Europeans saw as not farmable, arid, and feeling that people who have a culture and a space and ancestry here, oh, we'll just shove them over to Oklahoma. We're going to just shove them up to Wyoming. It doesn't matter what is here. If they're from Oklahoma, if they're from, and I shouldn't even use those terms because that's not the terms they used then. we're just going to move them around because their culture means nothing.
Right.
That's that power and assimilation and caste.
When the missionaries and explorers and first cartographers came through, they made an assumption that there was no structure to indigenous life.
Right.
And they made an assumption that because there were no structures in terms of houses of worship that the Europeans could recognize as that indigenous people lacked, first of all, any sort of organized philosophical or theological histories or traditions or perspectives, and that they weren't civilized because they couldn't recognize it. And then with the advent of the cultural genocide of the boarding school, that was catastrophic for Native people. My mother graduated from the St. Francis Indian boarding school in
I was hoping you would talk about that experience.
in 1952, and it destroyed her. I mean, it literally ruined her life. And given what we're learning now about intergenerational trauma and historical trauma, we can look around us in our own families and appreciate in conversations with other people from other nations where that historical trauma still sits very firmly in our new genetic makeup. The most deleterious dimension of the boarding school system with that erasure of cultural knowledge, cultural identity, and teaching children to feel shame for who they were, who their relatives were, for what their beliefs were, how they appeared. That's colonization of the mind. And in this poem I'd like to share when we wrap up, Denise Sweet says, colonization begins in the mind. And we have been able to see in Native, we've always seen this in Native America since the 1600s, when American Indians became literate and began reading and writing and publishing books and hymns and songs and speeches and so on and so forth. That this has been a slow movement, but it has gained a momentum that I find really awe-inspiring. Especially when we look at the political landscape in Congress now, with more and more indigenous lawmakers who are using their voices.
So I want to, because we were just talking about the Indian schools, I want to mention that our friends at the Chippewa Valley Museum have an exhibit where they talk a little bit about the dynamics in the area with that. And I will tell you that every July 4th I would go to Carson Park and go to the Chippewa Valley Museum because it was free that day. And I would walk through, and that was the spot where I would always pause, and I had to just sit there for a minute because I understand the dynamic of what's happening there. That whole mental colonization, trying to wipe culture clean, like get rid of it, eradicate it, and how absolutely ugly that is. So I'll just say to you, I'm sorry that your mom had to go through that your mother had to go through that. But how many people had to go through that, and how did it really mess that whole generational trauma, historical trauma, generational, passing it down to the next generation. I think we're just beginning to understand how that works, whether you're talking about descendants of American slaves, African slaves, or we're talking about indigenous peoples or whoever, whatever group has been oppressed or subjugated or marginalized. It's such an important dynamic for us to explore. I'm gonna change course here briefly for a second, but it's all related. Katie, putting you on the spot again. I had the pleasure of hearing you speak at a recent rally down at Randall Park, where we were standing in solidarity with Jacob Blake and his family and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I've heard you speak a couple of times, and you have a powerful voice, and I just want everybody to know, watch out. But beyond that, I would ask you to, if you would kind of reiterate what you said that day about Randall Park, if you would.
Oh, okay, that was a little bit ago. But I believe I was talking about the idea of how when we name parks and monuments after European people and we ignore the existence of Indigenous people on the land, we oftentimes don't even see them when we see the land. When we look at Eau Claire, we never see the Indigenous people that occupy the land. We just see the colonization, and we see we see the names after these parks. So we see, like Aiden Randall and, Owen Park and all these colonizers, but we don't see the people that occupied the land before. So, and when we continue to uphold these names and uphold this erasure, it just continues to ignore our existence, and to a point where it's just, we're not going to even be recognized on our own ancestral lands. Like, to the point where our ancestors might not even recognize us because we've been so erased from our own land. And we lose this connection when outsiders can't even recognize that the land is connected to us.
Yeah. When you said that, obviously it made a mark on me. It made me think about things a little bit more in regard to that. And I'm like, should we rename these? I mean, what should we do? I guess I would throw that out. Like, when you think about that, the irony of, so Aiden Randall, John S. Owen, William Carson, these were lumbermen, and they all have parks named after them here. They all donated the land. So we come back to this theme of this land is my land and that whole property ownership piece of things. They all three donated the land that became the parks that bear their names. And so what do we do with that? First of all, what do we do with that? Secondly, as people of Indigenous background and culture and heritage, like, what do you, Katie, you've already shared how you feel about it and what it makes you think of. Dr. Barker, I mean, like, when you see Randall Park and Aiden Randall donated that land, but it wasn't his land in the first place to donate, what does that do for you?
Well, I recognized it's self-congratulatory. It's self-laudatory. And a nice place to take history would be to have conversations with the descendants of the folks who lived in these spaces originally, and ask them about a way of not only renaming but reimagining the relationship that people in Eau Claire broadly can have with this space that we share and that we appreciate, that we enjoy. But this is a shared space now, but there's something so proprietary about those names that it's almost a kind of it's counting coup on a space, or these are marks of conquest. And what it does is it continuously reminds Indigenous people that not only were they at one point in a position of being conquered, but that Indigenous spaces have been and remain so.
Right. I don't know William Carson. He died a long time ago. Never met him. Could have been a good dude. Don't know. I have no idea. But one thing I will say is, like, you may come back with, well, they, what's the big deal? They donated the land. It's taking that one step back. Okay, they donated the land. How did they get the land in the first place? And I agree with you, that whole self-laudatory, like, pat myself on the back. But I think the bigger thing is it's a reminder of conquest, And so I'll use this as an opportunity and a platform to say, maybe City of Eau Claire, we should decide that we need to rename these parks. We should at least consider renaming these parks. And it doesn't have to be after, it can be simple names like river park, but something that doesn't remind a significant portion of our population of conquest. In some ways, it is reminiscent of Confederate statues and things like that.
Well, it's a part of this, and I hate to keep coming back to genocide, but it's part of this erasure.
Yep.
It is the erasure of indigenous people. And when you go back steps, you have to understand how they were removed, and how they were removed was violently. I'm trying to think, it's not Kendi who said it, it's the woman who won the Pulitzer Prize for the book about the Cahokia. And she said, the problem with Western Europeans in this land and on this land is if they couldn't figure out how to enslave you, they didn't know what to do with you, so they killed you. Or they tried to move you, but they didn't think you were human. And this erasure, whether, it's especially with Indigenous, because Indigenous have felt the brunt of both the physical erasure and the cultural erasure, if that makes sense. And even before we talk about the Indian schools, I'm thinking of Father Juniper Serra, who the Catholic Church, he's been beatified. They're trying to make him a saint, and there is strong opposition from Indigenous people in California because he would beat people and whip them, at least two, to death, to try to force them to confess Catholicism and let go of indigenous faith and indigenous cosmology. Indigenous knowledge. So imagine being tied to a pole and whipped to force you to let go of your faith, to force you to let go of your culture, to make somebody else happy. I mean, that really is the framework that when the president talks about a 1776 project and people being ugly about Indigenous Peoples Day today and saying, ugly things, that's the context that they have. They're not looking at, they think that Davy Crockett just wandered into the land and said, hey, I'm gonna take it. And they're not looking at the people that there were people that were there that were abused.
Great.
Absolutely abused. And they have no understanding that that abuse comes down to this day, and that's Dakota Pipeline. And that's Indigenous women are 2.5 times more likely to be sex trafficked or murdered than the next largest group, and that's Black women. So this abusiveness and this erasure is not just linked into history, it's still here.
And Columbus brought it here.
Yeah.
Columbus brought not only the slave trade in taking 10 people back as souvenirs, but also he initiated a sex trade amongst Indigenous girls. I mean, that was the reason for so many revolts, the Accola, the revolt in Accola, and then in the missions in California as well, is that 9 and 10-year-old girls were being sold, and they were circulated amongst the missions and abused there. And so what we're seeing now with the murdered and missing Indigenous women, we're seeing a pernicious sort of tradition that is the dark side of settler colonialism.
Yeah. We need to dive into that more. That's where we need to spend a little time here. Before we do that, though, I want to reintroduce all the people that we have here. In case you have just tuned in here in the last couple minutes, we've got our resident panelist, Dr. Selika Ducksworth-Lawton, who is a mainstay on the program and fellow troublemaker. Dr. Debra Barker from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire as well, also a part of the please help me if I don't pronounce this correctly, Sikangu?
Sikangu Lakota Nation.
Okay,
And I'm
I
also
was
director of the American Indian Studies program.
Yes, that too. And then we've got Katie Langer, who is a current UW-Eau Claire student and already is causing lots of trouble, like good trouble around town, which we dig. And then we've got Adam over there, who is taking care of watching the chat if we have any questions or anything come up. Adam, have we heard anything yet?
Don't have anything right now, but if you want to get involved with the conversation, feel free to drop those questions in the chat. Otherwise, you can give us a call at 715-600-0267. One more time, 715-600-0267.
Thanks, Adam. All right. So let's talk about our old friend, Christopher Columbus. So we have made the switch from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day here in Eau Claire. And in a lot of other communities that's happened in just recent years. Let's talk a little bit about the relationship. Let's expound upon what you've already shared, Dr. Barker, a little bit about the relationship between Christopher Columbus, his influence, what he brought, and all of this stuff we're talking about in terms of the dehumanization, deculturization of Indigenous peoples here in this part of the world. So I know you've got some stuff on your mind, Dr. Barker, regarding Mr. Columbus. So I'm going to hand it to you if you would just kind of talk a little bit about what you're thinking and what you feel like we really need to talk about tonight regarding him.
I remember the event of the city of Eau Claire making that shift to adopting Indigenous Peoples Day and moving away from Columbus Day. And that was a very difficult conversation. There's so many people whose identities are so connected to so many cycles of mythology in America. And Columbus is one of those cultural teddy bears, and it's one of those opportunities for school children to be dressed up like, we're moving into Thanksgiving next month. And it's an opportunity for school children then to be kind of indoctrinated about this mythology. So the shift to Indigenous Peoples Day, I think, is really healthy because it provides a little bit of a balance, and it opens up a space for conversations about who Columbus really was. And he, in his fourth voyage, he was taken back to Spain in chains because of, and this is, I find so interesting to me, because of the legacy of his leadership and the enslavement of not only Indigenous people, but that brilliant idea of going to Africa, and kidnapping people and implementing that slave trade, because the Pope at that point had decided that Native Americans had souls and they needed to be saved ASAP, so they got the missionaries involved here. With Columbus,
I'm sorry, just real quick.
I can
Just
jump
real
in on
quick.
that one.
No,
The Catholic-
I just have to say the irony of somebody saying, okay, those people have souls. We've figured that out now. They have souls. Just like the
But understand that didn't
arrogance.
stop any of these characters.
Right.
Because even as Indigenous people had souls, they're still putting in the recuerimiento and the mita. In Peru, in Mexico, they're still beating people to death. In California and Arizona, they're still slaughtering people.
Right.
It's one thing for the leadership to say, "Oh yeah, they have souls, so no, you can't just you can't just enslave them." They tried to enslave them anyway.
Yeah.
The reason why you see African slavery instead of Indigenous slavery, and to be honest, you do see Indigenous slavery in some places. The Choctaw, who are dark-skinned natives, well, first you had the Chickasaw who would enslave the Choctaw, and that's why the Choctaw would help enslaved Africans. But there were Spanish planters who tried to enslave the Choctaw. They just couldn't get the Choctaw because the Choctaw knew the land, and they, to be honest, were better fighters. The same when we talk about Seneca and some of the other groups. But it's not because the Pope said they had souls. It's because they couldn't figure out a way how. Because the story of indigenous people in the United States is one of resistance. People think on the East Coast, indigenous people are this myth that went away because they've been so well erased when you get to places like Ohio and Virginia and et cetera. And that's not it. There's always been resistance. I can't think of the indigenous group that when the Klan tried to go mess with their land, I wanted to say it's in South Dakota, they came out with rifles and ran them off.
The American Indian Movement?
No, this would have been in 1952. And there was oil and there was something like that, but they ran them off. So there's always been this history of resistance with indigenous people.
We have the resistance, and I wanted to be sure to say this because when we talk about the number of people who succumb to genocide, warfare, and in the boarding school, disease, malnutrition, suicide, we have to take it back a little bit farther and think about the figures. Historians have posited that right before Columbus got here, there were perhaps 100 million indigenous people in North and South America. In the 1910 census, there were 238,000 American Indians left. And in 1910, that would have been including my grandparents on both sides and great-grandparents. And in the 2010 census, the numbers are upward of 3 million. So the resistance is happening just by survival. I just finished teaching this novel in my introduction to American Indian literature class, and in this novel there is a plot that turns on biological warfare. The military began routinely infecting blankets with smallpox, the smallpox virus, and then leaving them out for Native people to collect, and then of course they shared those. Because there's such strong cultures of generosity, all across Native America with that. And that seems really poignant now, thinking about COVID and thinking about all the Indian reservations that are understaffed and underfunded by the federal government, which is a kind of quiet genocide that persists.
Mm.
Well, with Cahokia, wasn't it the ships, the traders who were coming up the Mississippi River, and they had the underground storage for the corn, which was fine until those trader ships had European rats on them and came out and got into their corn stores and destroyed their ability to survive winter with the corn stores. And those traders didn't take care to protect the people from themselves. And the missionary did not. When missionaries meet indigenous people, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about 1660 or we're talking about today. The first problem is that they are going to be carrying germs and diseases that those indigenous people are not going to be prepared for. And often, the first thing that's going to weaken those people will be that disease. I mean, we're seeing this in Brazil now, where there are these missionaries who keep trying to go out there, but people are saying, no, you can't, you're going to kill them. What if you take COVID out there? They have they don't have any immunity. And these missionaries knew about the Black Plague, they knew about all this stuff. They didn't care.
Right.
And the people who want to look at this history and dismiss it and say, well, that was then and we should just get over it, are missing the fact that that gets magnified down through the ages. They stole Cahokia's wealth. They stole the Lumbee's wealth. they stole people's wealth, but their wealth was not the land. Their wealth was the culture and the people and the relationship. Does that make sense?
It's indigenous epistemology that has somehow, by a miracle, survived, and largely survived because it went underground. So in the advent of the reservation system and the missions that were established, and these boarding schools, which were basically, we could call them re-education camps or military prisons for children. Nevertheless, much of this knowledge has survived, thankfully, because you know what you're talking about, Selika, when you're talking about the decimation of millions of people, you're thinking about the historians, you're thinking about the teachers, you're thinking about the artists, you're thinking about architects, you're thinking about mathematicians. I mean, indigenous culture was incredibly rich and well-rounded. But in an analogy, but to give you an example of the persistence and the resistance of Native people, on Rosebud, in South Dakota, for example, Indian people could still have their sun dances, but they took them out in places that were more secluded, and they held them on the 4th of July. So Indian agents saw them back there, celebrating, the 4th of July. And in fact, this is a way that culture went underground and managed to survive in spite of settler colonialism.
You used a big word a minute ago, and I'm going to ask you to explain that word for dim-witted folks like me. Epistemology. What does that word mean?
Knowledge.
Okay.
Yeah. We call it now traditional ecological knowledge. And this is the knowledge that has been, thankfully, handed down from generation to generation for thousands of years.
Does it kind of get into how do you know what you know? Is that kind of part of what epistemology is?
No.
Or what's the source of your knowledge? Where is it coming from?
Yeah, what is the source of your knowledge? And the source of indigenous knowledge really returns to the land, which is where your question started. And that is that when indigenous people spend hundreds of years studying their environment and studying not only the environment, but all the other beings that inhabit that environment, and coming to understand and know about how bears survive, for instance. And learning that kind of knowledge and applying that to their own survival. So bears, for example, knew about red willow, which now we know from a pharmaceutical standpoint was aspirin. Aspirin is derived from red willow branches. And so in fact, we have a friend of ours who lives in Wyoming, and she had been bothered by a bear that was sick, and it was starting to come around her house, and the bear was shot. The bear was shot. Not of her doing, but when it was taken to the veterinarian who did the autopsy on the bear, the veterinarian discovered was that the bear had been packing one of his teeth with this kind of moss that has medicinal properties to not only deaden the pain, but also to provide some antiseptic properties. But the bear was wounded in some other ways as well, and it was the influence, of course, of the humans. But so that traditional knowledge, that epistemology, is not only an understanding of how to survive in the world, but it's also an understanding of how to emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually survive the unknown and the unexpected.
Right.
And so oral traditions hold all those stories of survival.
It feels like a little bit to me like the idea of trying to understand how creation works so that you can fit within the flow of how creation works.
Exactly. and not trying to control it.
Right. Right. There are theological paths we could take with that one, which Selika and I are notorious for starting to walk down that road when we shouldn't.
I'm going to behave.
But yeah, I mean, I love that. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about, that resonates very much with how, as I grow and recognize how little I know about a lot of things, that's the way my own worldview is developing, is that I think the way I'm wired is to figure out how life is wired and figure out how I fit within the framework of that generally. It's not just about me and what I want to do. And I was thinking too about a little bit about, and so this is important, I think, to say. We've talked about missionaries, and Selika, has been very critical about the Catholic Church in North America, and rightfully so, right? Like I'm not hollering at you, Selika. It's okay.
I was going to say, I'm a Catholic. I get to criticize.
Well, and that's what I wanted to say, is that that's coming from a person of faith.
Yes.
And even for me, like, I can look at the heritage that Columbus has left here, knowing that he came under the auspices and blessing of the Catholic Church, of the Christian Church. And knowing that the missionaries did the same, and they came here and still dehumanized populations of people, and there was genocide of all different flavors, and know that is not a great representation of how I understand what I see in the Bible. In fact, there was a book that was written by a guy named Stephen Keeler years ago. It was a book that I had in college. I've started to read it a bunch of times, but I've never read the whole thing. But the whole premise of the book, it's called This Rebellious House. And the whole premise of the book is about how European American especially, culture has developed in this rebellion against the way God made life to be lived. And I see that, like, when you talk about Columbus coming in, the human trafficking thing and using people as trophies and the enslavement and all those things, doesn't look anything like the belief system that the church purports, right? And yet it was done under the blessing of the church. There's just it's a huge disconnect there.
Well, the church comes in, and I hate to say it this way, but it's true. It's rather, whether we're talking about North America, whether we're talking about Africa, whether we're talking about Asia. First you have the missionaries, then you have the traders, then you have the guns. And that is, and the missionaries, and this is where that road to hell is paved with good intentions. They think they're saving souls because they can't recognize the genius of the people who are in front of them.
There's a joke. It's a tired joke, but the joke goes something like this: in the beginning, we had the land and they had the book, and now we have the book and they have the land.
Yes. And I mean, even, and you try to look at a good side out of it, but the good side isn't good because the stereotypes, so you have the negative stereotypes and you have the positive stereotypes, and this is where I was going to go. And the positive stereotype of the mystical Native American has to drive y'all nuts.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I've seen all the posts about, will y'all stop with the spirit animals thing?
Oh.
And it's kind of like, I'm from Louisiana, it's the burn the black candle. I get to say burn the black candle, because that's my culture. I'm not saying I do that. I am not saying I do that, but that's my culture. But there's other people who want to adopt that. I mean, so I'm turning us a little bit. How do we deal with these people who want to dehumanize and stereotype Indigenous people into this caricature or this performance of what they think is Indigenous?
It's dehumanizing. It's racism. It's a unique kind of racism. The cultural critic Paul Chet-Smith talks about this unique kind of racism that fetishizes Native people and Native beliefs. But what it does is that, it removes them from contemporaneous life And what it does is it denies their humanity, that Native people are multidimensional, that Native people, they are Catholic, they're Protestant, they're Baptist, they're Mormon, they're atheists, they're agnostics, they're across the spectrum of human behavior, that Native Americans are multidimensional. And that is something that that one of the tribal elders that I'm doing some writing on his novels and on his philosophies, and he says that's one point that he wanted to stress in his stories about America, and writing Lakota Westerns from a Lakota point of view, for example. But this mythologizing, I mean, Americans have, and I'm overgeneralizing here, and I apologize in advance for that, but just the whole mythology around Christopher Columbus started with the same person who created Washington Irving, who wrote the Legends of Sleepy Hollow, and Rip Van Winkle. He was, for some reason, he was traveling abroad, and he went to Spain, and he was asked to do some translation of some documents that were in an archive in Madrid. And as he's going through these documents about Christopher Columbus, he said, "Oh, this is really interesting stuff." So what he decided to do, Washington Irving, this is in 1828, he published a biography of Christopher Columbus. It was entirely fictionalized.
So it's a little bit like the development of the legend of Santa Claus.
Exactly. And because that mythology was so compatible with the spirit of the time in the early 1800s, this is a time of nation building, post-Revolutionary War. We've got the Louisiana Purchase. We have Lewis and Clark. We've got the removals that were happening. Manifest Destiny, which was a phrase that was created by a journalist. And it was he was a kind of yellow journalist because he liked to sell headlines. But yeah, I mean, when we go back to the mythology around Columbus, we're going back to a whole body of myth that becomes history. And I find that very, very dangerous for Americans, because it's easy and I catch myself in this myself. I remember coming back, my husband and I the last time we lived in Asia and had a difficult experience for a variety of reasons. We returned, and I remember sitting in a football stadium in Milwaukee, watching a Packer game and looking at the American flag, and I'm just thinking, I am so glad to be back. I love this place. And I really, really do. I mean, I really do love America. What I find so maddening is the way that the difficulty in accepting the history of America, which is fraught. It's not perfect, and it's not a myth. It's highly complex, full of all these complex figures.
Right.
And I think we need to do more teaching, more objective teaching around those historical figures and events.
Okay, so now we've drifted back toward one of my principles that I bring up on almost every show, and that's that every person is fundamentally flawed and screwed up and limited. And so I think some of the things I think about with that is I think about, like the founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, those guys, like they're so, they are basically sainted, in our culture. And yet, like, they're screwed up. They were screwed up. They owned slaves. They had all kinds of mess, all kinds of blood on their hands. And I think there's this part of me that I feel like if we could just own the fact that none of the people who have lived in America have ever been perfect, that we've all been screwed up, including our leaders And when you throw in the fact that we're fundamentally flawed anyway, and when you give somebody power who's fundamentally flawed, it's going to flaw them even further most of the time. So.
I want to quote Pete. I read a piece that Pete Myers had done. It was back and forth about a book review. And it was about the reason why Native Americans were not considered citizens.
Oh.
Until it's the 1920s, right?
1924.
Until the National Origins Act. And that it was in part because the Founding Fathers did not respect Indigenous and African as civilized. And the context of the argument was, it wasn't reparations. The context was the 14th Amendment rightfully decided? Should Native Americans and should Africans have been simply extended citizenship in that manner, or should there have had to have been consent from the Europeans? And it is just such an amazing assumption to look at, because they're arguing that the Founding Fathers didn't think so this is this radical leap. Well, if the Founding Fathers didn't think the people who were here before they showed up shouldn't have been citizens, maybe we need to talk about some of the problems with that.
Right.
I call a lot of what we teach fan fiction.
Yes.
Historical fan fiction or groupie fan fiction. I do a lot of unteaching. But there are people who really love that fan fiction. They want to believe that the U.S. especially, they get really mad when I point out there are no Americans in the Bible. They get really mad about that. And they have that city on a hill, manifest destiny. And to talk about the fact that that manifest destiny came at the expense of picking fights with and using the army against people who just wanted to be left alone, especially after 1866. That's not something they want to think about. They want to think about, my ancestor came here, got off the boat, worked hard, and now look at what I have.
Right.
It's not, well, yeah, I got an extra heads up because they went and they killed off this Lakota family here, or they massacred this group here, and I could get land for nothing.
It reminds me of the line in Hamilton, dare I venture into Hamilton. And I don't love it as much as my wife loves it, but it's there, And where they're having the debate, and they're talking about creating the national bank and all this kind of stuff. And Thomas Jefferson says, "Why do we want to take on New York's debt?" And Hamilton comes back, well, you don't have any debt because you don't pay for labor. It's the same kind of idea, like you have a leg up. Before we go any further, though, Adam has a question from our community members.
Yes, I've got a question from Randy here on Facebook. So, Dr. Barker, I know that you kind of were talking about how complex these issues are and how it's the acknowledgement of Indigenous Peoples Day in the city of Eau Claire was kind of a big step to having more open conversations and more honest conversations about Indigenous peoples and their history in the Chippewa Valley. So Randy wants to know what can be done now to recognize, acknowledge, and honor the Indigenous people from this area. So open that up for discussion amongst the panel.
Take the opportunity of Indigenous Peoples Day to acknowledge the survival. And there's a way that, especially around Thanksgiving, and we do a lot of teaching and a lot of programming at the university around working with areas of absence where there simply is a lack of knowledge or lack of education about Native people or the presence of Native people in the Chippewa Valley. And beginning with the Land Acknowledgement and now Indigenous Peoples Day, I would like to see, there was a very fraught conversation in which a couple of the resolutions were stripped out of that final vote. And what it was, the justification was that by admitting that this country, or North America broadly, Mesoamerica, it is the occasion of historic land theft. And then so much of the land in the Chippewa Valley came into the hands of people who put so much pressure on Indigenous people to cede land. And cede is such a neutral sort of word that covers up the reality of pressure, which is, you know, we know your family's starving. You know, we know that that you're losing your opportunities to hunt, for instance, because the resources are becoming scarcer and scarcer. But we're going to give you this reservation, and we're going to give you health care for your children and education for your children, and then to put people in remote areas and then walk away and ignore them for the next century or so, and then wait for the magic of assimilation for Native people to just sort of finally disperse into the general population. I think that if we could do more teaching in the Chippewa Valley around Indigenous presence, which is everywhere. Native people are everywhere. It's just that the marking, you know, if people are not culturally marked with horses, braids, feathers, headdresses, yeah, the war bonnet, those kinds of cultural markers, that then Indians become invisible. And Native people, I mean, we know each other, we recognize each other. But I think that with more and more conversations broadly like this, then more and more non-Native people will come to see us.
And can I put in a plug for the American Indian Studies move? You know, we have an American Indian Studies department, and Dr. Barker leads it, and there's classes. Take the classes if you're here. Take the classes at Stout. If you're at Stout, you can come and take the classes here, and they transfer over. You know, I mean, take these classes.
They're offered through community ed.
You know, they're offered through the community ed. We have 2 Native American historians who are also cross-listed with American Indian Studies. That's John Mann and Andrew Sturdivant. And Cheryl Jimenez Fry, who is here, she studies Indigenous people in Mexico and Latin America. So that goes across. We also have Geraldo Licon, who is in Latin American studies, but he studies the Yaka Indians in the US at the borderlands. Because to be honest, borders are just lines. And Indigenous people who had always lived there, they had always gone across. And even after we declare these lines, they're just going across because that's what they have always done.
Because the lines were dumb.
And the lines are dumb. I mean, think of Juarez and El Paso. I mean, it's just, so what we call undocumented, when you're in Texas and parts of California, et cetera, that's Indigenous people just following the paths that they had always followed. We are the ones who are trying to impose this craziness on them.
Yeah.
Take the classes, learn something about this. And don't have a cow whenever the school district tries to have some sort of class about something and you decide it's not celebratory enough.
Or un-American.
You know, this performance of patriotism that says we have to, and I call it a performance because it's not real patriotism. It's just like people perform love. Somebody who's cheating on you is going to get really publicly cushy and everything else because they don't want you to know that they're cheating on you. Well, performative patriotism is the same way. They're going to have a cow about us telling the truth about this history of Indigenous people. How dare we? And it's because they're insecure. But we have to know this. This is like, it's a wound. And until we clean out this wound, we will never be whole.
Somebody smarter than me once said, and there are a lot of people in that category, the truth will set you free. It's not your glorified imagery of the past that sets you free. It's actually the truth that sets you free. And I think that's my own experience, aside from platitudes, my own experience when I have had to look back at the past, what I've experienced personally, wounds that I've experienced, that things have been done to me, things I've been done to myself, things that I've done to other people for which I started recognizing how I damaged them. There was no healing or freedom in those things until I started to reckon with the truth of what was there. And it's the same dynamic on a cultural level, on a community level that we're talking about here, is that I'm just going to say this is going to sound grandiose, and I don't mean it this way, but America will never live up to its potential unless we reckon with these truths and walk through them and actually do what it takes to heal.
Unless we pay some back rent.
Yes.
There you go.
We need to pay some back rent.
I'm not saying it happened for sure, but somebody on this panel said in celebration, and I saw this on Facebook today, I'm not naming any names, but somebody said in celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day that you should send their money.
All right, you got a Venmo here?
I mean, it's like, look at the idea, the fact that like we do all this celebratory stuff but won't send poor people, like poor Indigenous people, money. When you have like the idea, like we have like the idea of like the blackout with like social media, which doesn't do anything when they're still poor single mothers, struggling to feed her family.
Preach now, preach, come on.
So like, you know, like when you have these problems within society that you can clearly fix by opening your pockets and you don't, then that becomes a problem.
Well, it's performative. Look at me, how woke I am.
Yeah.
Okay, can you make a donation? Nope. I mean, we have a lot of people who are performative, whether we're talking about a performative Christianity that isn't real, or a performative anti-racism that ends when comfort gets challenged.
Right.
And that is one of the bigger problems.
Even within like the Indigenous community, especially, like we had this TikToker come up, that one with the cranberry juice uncle guy. Everyone loves him, but he said the N-word, and then he was called out on it. And he literally said, "I do as I please," which is a big problem. And how we can't even get over the fact that we hold on to our idols to the point where we can't even hold them accountable. And we can't even see their own prejudices because the fact that we just put them on such high pedestals. And then we get hurt by that because we don't allow them to make mistakes.
Well, we don't allow them to be human. In some ways.
You're getting back to my point now.
Well, I mean, it's like with Indigenous people and this performance thing. If Indigenous people do not perform Native the way certain people wanted to be performed, they get punished. And that can be from the left or from the right. And I saw that when I first moved here was the height, really, of the fishing wars. And I would walk into bars. Now realize there was like, 40 black people in this whole area? And I would walk into bars, see a sign, save a walleye, kill an Indian. And I would walk back out. And the people I was with, because I was playing volleyball, people I was with, why are you walking out? Why is this upsetting you? What's the problem? And it's because, well, if y'all gonna act like that to Native people, what you gonna act like to other brown people? Yeah. It never occurred to them that I should have solidarity with you. And that I should be offended at seeing that. They were inviting me into whiteness.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, you need to stop that.
And that's not even good whiteness that they're inviting
No, it was
you
not
into.
good whiteness, and it was a couple of really bad bars too. But
So
we,
listen.
we had our Native American art professor had her gas tank sugared. That's why she left and she went to San Diego. One of our Native American historians who was here then was threatened during that time period because comfort meant more than respecting people's rights.
Yep. So it's 8:54.
Oops.
And we got to start winding down. So there's a couple things I wanted to mention before we usually you have to hear from me at the end. We're actually going to let Dr. Barker kind of give us some closing thoughts here before I close out the show for good here. Number one, we've mentioned Thanksgiving a couple times tonight. We're going to continue this discussion in a way the Monday before Thanksgiving, which I believe is November 23rd. Does that sound right? We're going to have Thanksgiving through Indigenous eyes that night. And Dr. Barker doesn't know it yet, but we were already going to ask her to be a part of it, and probably Katie too, but whatever, we'll talk about that later. And then Dr. Barker also had a list of resources, and we don't have time to go through those now, but maybe we can get that list and put it out in the chat or on Facebook so people have access to it.
Yeah, sure.
With that in mind, you have a poem that you'd like to share with us, and I'd like to go ahead and give you the floor for that.
Okay. I just want to say one thing, because Halloween's coming up. And so this is some advice for people who want to be allies, and there's a perception that Native people that we don't appreciate or we don't invite alliances. We certainly do. And we value and respect those alliances. Here's some advice. Don't dress Native children don't dress children in Halloween costumes as Indians, because it perpetuates stereotypes and it teaches children cultural appropriation. So just don't even do that. So that's the one thing. And yeah, I do have a list, and these are resources that are really useful for educators at all ages, and many of these are from the perspective of Native educators. Okay.
Great.
But this poem was written by a past Wisconsin poet laureate, Denise Sweet, who was a student here at UW-Eau Claire, and she was the director of the First Nations program at UW Green Bay. And this poem is called the 500-Year-Old Poem, and it's an epistolary poem. So in that, it's a letter. This poem began 500 years ago this morning, when I traced the numbers of generations of our grandchildren, Mr. Columbus, the greats of offspring that discovered you on that Caribbean island, you claimed for your European benefactors. They are here today. We are still here on that island, on other islands. We are still here on the deltas to the south, rebuilding our traditional shelters after hurricanes. We are still here, gathered around the Great Lakes, giving thanks for the good grain, manomen, and our harvest ceremonies, while our grandmothers and grandfathers teach us the real old songs of gratitude and of reverence. We are still here in the Black Hills and at Big Mountain and at James Bay, where big business and big government tries to rid itself of the nuisance of Native people. We are in solidarity at the fence lines in Hopi and Navajo land, and at the boat landings in Balsam Lake, and in Solom Springs, and in Lac du Flambeau. Indeed, we are even at the mouth of the Mississippi, where the drum carries a true Thanksgiving prayer for the land and the water that holds and carries our healing medicines. We are here at Octawake and at Waktasane and at Akwesage, where our spirits and in our languages say, where our spiritual elders say, no more. To the harassment, to the removal, to the imprisonment, and to what they say in America, development, because they know what they know, and they are praying as hard as they can that you will come to know it as well. we are here. We are still here on clouded land at White Earth, where Anishinaabe Akin and women warriors like Winona Duke say, 500 years of taking is long enough. Say, you can return to the last of our original lands. Say, the U.S. government has failed to uphold the spirit and the letter of the law of the land according to the Treaty of 1887, 1854, and 1872. And we are going to recover those stolen lands, acre by acre, inch by inch, even if we have to buy them back. That is what she said, and that is what I say. We are here. We are still here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barker. Appreciate that very much. There's nothing I could have said that sums up what we've talked about better than that. So thank you so much. Also want to thank the Pablo Center, Uniting Bridges, Converge Radio, and our incredible panelists for tonight for this conversation. Next week, we're going to be talking about policing in the Valley. And we're going to have Chief Matt Rokas from Eau Claire here, as well as some other panelists. And we're excited to engage in that conversation. Thank you so much for tuning in this week to Conversations in Color. And we hope to talk to you next week as well.